The Data Collectors. Written by Danielle Palli. Narrated by Graham Mack and Danielle Palli. 13. All Men Are Crazy. Sunday morning. 5 years after the assembly.
He told you what? That he's an alien.
Fatima grinned gleefully from the corner of the couch where she sat, nestled, hugging a throw pillow to her chest.
When did he have time to tell you that?
Lucene stood behind the couch, before being summoned back to the kitchen by a tea kettle whistling on the stove.
Sometime between let's have port and pass the creme brulee? Relax.
Fatima called after her.
It was at the end of the evening after the boys left and you were clearing the dishes. How fun is that? I'm not sure why you find this so amusing.
Lucene returned to the living room, handing Fatima a cup of tea. While cooking was not her thing, tea she could manage.
What? It's not like it's the first time I dated someone who claimed to be from another planet.
Fatima reflected.
Besides, you of all people should know that there are some aliens taking up residence on Earth. Yeah?
Lucene agreed.
But there's so much controversy around them, most keep a low profile and don't advertise it. Particularly beings who look so much like us that we wouldn't know the difference without checking the international registry. Why would he be so open about it?
Lucene thought back to her recent encounter with Cepheus. Previously, her only interaction with other life forms, to her knowledge, was when she was working with the UC, and that was merely as an observer. And even then, they were tuning in from their home planet, not Earth. Somewhere in the corners of her brain, a memory surfaced. It had something to do with Cepheus and his connection to the IPP.
Look, I'm not saying I believe him.
Fatima interrupted the thought, and it vanished as quickly as it arose.
Just that I don't care if he thinks he is. He's sweet.
Fatima sighed wistfully.
But that's crazy. All men are crazy.
Fatima reasoned.
At least this one's not suicidal. I once had a boyfriend, this was before you moved in here, who threatened to chain himself to the underside of a delivery truck and let himself get dragged to death if I didn't get back with him after we broke up. What did you do? I felt so bad we dated for another year. Oh, Fatima.
Lucene shook her head, taking a seat beside her friend.
The way I see it...
Fatima paused to take a sip of tea, nodding with approval at its preparation.
We choose our life experience, our reality, if you will. If he chooses a life experience where he's an alien, then who might argue? But what if his life experience can potentially cause harm to your reality?
Fatima waved her hand in the air.
Oh, he's harmless, even if he is a bit paranoid. Paranoid? What do you mean paranoid? He thinks he's one of the last data collectors left on the planet. What?
Lucene's eyes widened. Synapses in her brain began to reconfigure and connect as memories from 5 years ago began to flash like camera bulbs behind her eyes.
You know, the story on the news a couple years back about aliens from Aird hiding out among us, collecting information to report back? No, I know who they're supposed to be. I'm just surprised he claimed to be one. A little odd that he would surface at the same time as Cepheus and Tanager. Did the men secretly know each other or pretend not to for some reason? What's wrong?
Fatima looked concerned.
Your face turned white as a ghost. Does this have something to do with your time in New York? I know you don't like to talk about it, but I just want you to be careful. Aw, that's why I love you, my friend. I will be careful. So what's he collecting data on?
Lucene asked.
Don't they have a specific area of expertise?
Fatima giggled, settling back on the couch.
Oh, you're going to love this. He's studying the nuances of romantic relationships. He wasn't lying when he said he was writing a white paper last night at dinner. And get this, he told me he didn't believe in love at first sight until he saw me. That's very sweet.
Lucene was unconvinced.
And where's the lover boy today? Said he had to meet another of his friends from back home today, some guy named Jim Sparks. What a funny name, lives on a boat. Another data collector, so there's 2 of them? Yeah, but they have to be careful since they tend to be a target for hate groups. Come to think of it, maybe I shouldn't have told you.
Fatima looked concerned.
Fatima, who would I tell? I'm practically a hermit. Reverend Isabella, or I don't know, maybe your new boyfriend Tanager?
She teased.
He's not my... Never mind.
Lucene stood.
Speaking of Reverend Isabella, I've got to run some errands and get to work. I promised I'd get there early to help set up for the new moon celebration she's having tonight. I don't understand you, Lucene.
Fatima eyed her friend curiously.
You have a master's degree and had a great job at the UC that had tremendous potential for growth. Why on earth, no pun intended given our recent conversation, would you take on an entry-level administrative job at a local church that pays minimum wage with no hope of advancement? I don't get it. No, you don't,
Lucene answered.
And I'm afraid I can't explain it to you. I'm sorry. Maybe it's not limited to men. Maybe we're all crazy. Perhaps.
Lucene acknowledged, as she made her way back to the bedroom to grab a pair of shoes.
But not everyone's brain got fried by lightning either. I can't explain to you what I can't remember. True,
Fatima acknowledged.
But you remembered me.
She smiled as Lucene resurfaced from her bedroom moments later.
How could I forget?
Lucene pinched her friend's cheek playfully.
Hey, don't wait up. I'm heading to a family reunion today and won't be back till late. If you change your mind and want to join us, the number's on the fridge. Thanks,
Lucene answered awkwardly. To say that Fatima's family was fun-loving was an understatement, and yet she still couldn't handle the energy of being around that many people in one location.
I will.
In the meantime, she made a mental note to ask Tanager about Roman and investigate this Jim Sparks. She couldn't explain it to Fatima because she couldn't quite understand it herself. Lucene looked down at her arms. People viewed them with odd fascination, as if she had an intricate henna work tattooed on her arms. But to her, their patterns unlocked the secret somehow, except that ever since she got them, she couldn't remember what it was. She barely remembered the car accident that killed her parents, nor did she remember the lightning strike or much that happened in the first 7 years of her life. But she did remember meeting Fatima in the hospital room as a child, and was grateful for the only true friendship she'd had for most of her adult life. Lucene pulled Kermit into a New Age shop and pulled out her list. Reverend Isabella had sent her in to pick up Peruvian resin and a hand drum she was having repaired. The woman behind the counter greeted her with a smile.
Hi, Lucy.
She beamed in spite of Lucene's many requests to be called by her complete name. The shop owner never seemed to remember. Lucene cringed, but said nothing. She gave a polite smile back.
I've got Reverend Isabella's drum right here.
She pulled it from underneath the counter.
Thanks.
Lucene picked up a bag of resin from a wall display and placed it on the counter.
We need this too. So weird,
the woman continued, carefully unwrapping the drum that she had rolled in a cloth for protection.
You can see it's smooth again, but...
She ran her hand over it for emphasis.
How on earth did it get punctured like that? It's like someone jabbed a knife through it. I couldn't say,
Lucene answered.
How much do I owe you?
After completing the transaction, Lucene left the store and climbed into her vehicle with the resin and drum placed carefully on the passenger seat. It wasn't as if she didn't like people, but she didn't trust inquisitive ones who can't remember your name even after you've been a customer for more than 4 years. The less she knew, Lucene reasoned, the better. She had no idea how the drum got damaged in the first place, but since Reverend Isabella didn't ask her a lot of questions, she gave her boss and mentor the same respect. In truth, Reverend Isabella had been the one person who had been able to help her with her glitches, like the one she'd experienced the first day in her meditation class. Since then, her mentor had made a point of inviting her to every meditation, yoga, and Tai Chi class held at the sanctuary. She periodically suggested for Lucene to be mindful of, encouraging her to practice this while tending to her tasks of gardening, cleaning, or providing info to attendees. Things like,
when trimming shrubs in the garden, be sure to thank them for providing oxygen to the air we breathe and for protecting us from the harsh sun. Let them know you are trimming them so they may continue to be a source of health and beauty to all who visit.
Or when a northern mockingbird randomly flew through an open window into the main hall, she'd say,
Ask them what message they have for you and be sure to thank them. Guide them to the window if they've gotten lost and give them space to leave unharmed.
And when that backfired, like when the shrubs and birds became too chatty instead of calling her crazy, Reverend Isabella taught her to mentally separate herself from the chatter. Since she quickly learned that red doors were a source of stress, Lucene was taught to shut the red door, leaving the sounds behind it until she was ready to address them. Lucene didn't understand her phobia, or the flashes of insight that would hit her like 1,000 radio waves tuning in to different channels, all at the same time. But she was grateful to have someone treat it as a gift to be trained instead of a mental illness to be eradicated. So while she may have been making only minimum wage at a little sanctuary in parish, the benefits she received working there were profound. Plus, she felt safe being hidden away from normal day-to-day interactions. This is why she stayed. But she couldn't quite articulate this to Fatima. She wasn't sure if she would ever be able to. 14. Family. 30 years ago. 25 years before the assembly. Tanager! 2 small boys, spouting a mess of curly orange hair on their heads, ran up, each wrapping their arms around one of his legs, as Tanager pretended to struggle as he walked through the door.
Boys!
A tall woman with bright auburn hair called, cradling a small child as she reached the door. Tanager! Tanager! One of the boys tugged at his pant leg. Guess what I'm going to be when I'm as big as you are? He asked without waiting for an answer. He spat out, A data collector! He smiled a wide, crooked smile. Tanager mused his hair. Well, that's a noble occupation. The other boy would not be overshadowed by his twin. And I'm going to be a professor, just like you and my dad, he proclaimed proudly.
That's enough, boys.
The red-haired woman intervened.
Go and help your dad with the samphire stew.
She leaned over to touch her forehead, to Tanager's, in a warm greeting.
So nice to see you again, friend.
You as well, Petrichor. And this must be the lovely Tulula. He went to stroke the baby's fine hair with his hand, but the child caught one of his fingers and held on with pure fascination, giggling gleefully. The grip of a tigress, he complimented. What a strong soul. She takes after her mother, Cepheus's wife smiled. Come in, dinner will be ready in just a moment. Tanager followed Petrichor through their living room. While he'd been in their home a number of times, he was still in awe of it. There were 2 built-in waterfalls on each side of the room that flowed gently into a pond that poured under the walkway where he now stood. Live vines hung from the ceilings with bright yellow, orange and red flowers growing from them.
Be careful of the walleyes,
she warned, glaring at her feet.
They appear to be agitated today.
As if on cue, several fish leapt across Tanager's feet, disappearing under the water. Dinner was held at a small round table in the kitchen. Unlike the living room, the kitchen was simple, with stations for growing hydroponic herbs and vegetables, a station for preparing food, one for cooking, and another for assembly. Behind the stations were walk-in units with food stored at varied temperatures. The assembly line ended, and the kitchen table began, making the layout as efficient as possible. Adjacent to the kitchen was a formal dining area used to entertain dignitaries, colleagues, friends, and distant relatives. But Tanager wasn't considered merely a friend and colleague. He was an honorary member of their immediate family, and despite a considerable age gap, Cepheus regarded Tanager as his brother. And so he sat at the informal table in the kitchen as a sign of high respect. One of the boys ran around the table, laying out platters, while the other filled glasses with water. This boy had a tentacled creature stuck to his shoulder. its suction arms wrapped around the boy's arm, and a bulbous, one-eyed head peering at Tanager curiously. It tapped the edge of its tentacle like a dog wagging its tail.
Seffi, get Merla out of the kitchen and back into the water. She's no business being at the dinner table.
The boy reluctantly took his 5-legged pet into the living room and released her into the pond.
Wash your hands,
she commanded once he returned. As was custom, everyone took their place once dinner was ready. Cepheus went around the table with a stew cart, passing out food and bread to the boys, then his wife, then Tanager. Baby Tallulah sat in a safety chair next to Petrichor, being bottle-fed by a mechanical system attached to the chair. Once everyone's plate was filled, he filled his own and took a seat. Petrichor reached for a bottle of homemade pomegranate and blackberry wine, pouring it into an empty cup and passing it to Tanager, who accepted with a smile before doing the same for herself and her husband. Petrichor was the best winemaker in their village. During one particularly poor growing season, her vineyard thrived, while many others failed to produce a single crop. It was Cepheus's belief that his wife had literally loved the vineyard back to life. They held hands in a moment of silence, each giving thanks to the spirit of their choice, before the boys dug into their food with gusto. "I have news," Cepheus proclaimed eagerly. Tanager quickly swallowed a mouthful of stew before answering. "What news?" "Dora and Zan have finally made contact." "Really?" Tanager seemed surprised. "After hearing nothing for 2 years, I was worried something had happened to them." "As was I," Cepheus nodded. "And something did happen. Something wonderful." "Well, don't keep me in suspense."
They had a baby girl,
Petrichor announced, reaching over and touching Tallulah's cheek and smiling. "On Earth? That is good news." "There's more," Cepheus said. "What?" "The child has abilities." "Abilities?" Tanager questioned. "Without any genetic altering, she was inherently born with all of the same abilities as our data collectors." "Astonishing!" "A natural empath, born of 2 genetically enhanced data collectors." "Her skills have to be developed, of course," Cepheus explained, in between sips of wine. "But now that Dora and Zan have resumed communication, I can begin mentoring her remotely." "Wonderful news, but did they say why they dropped communication?" "Let's just say it was unsafe for them at the time." He sent a knowing glance in his boy's direction, and Tanager understood. Tanager redirected the conversation. "This calls for a tribute." He raised his glass in a toast, and Cepheus and Petrichor joined in. "We send blessings to the beautiful family that is Dora, Zan, and... what's the child's name?" "Lucene," Cepheus supplied. Tanager suddenly got chills down his spine, but didn't know why the name had significance. He shook it off and smiled. The children had all been put to bed, and Cepheus, Tanager, and Petrichor were sitting in the living room, watching the walleyes jump as they sipped an after-dinner cocktail. Merla was acting strangely, Petrichor noted, as their octopus-like pet climbed the vines of one of the walls.
"Strange. She's never done that before."
Moments later, there was a loud explosion as the walls of the living room caved in, sending water, debris, and bloody walleyes flying mid-air, smacking down on what was left of the stone walkway that had bisected the living room. Petrichor had barely yelled, "The children!" when there was a second explosion at the back of the house. Her face contorted in horror. Royal soldiers poured in, several grabbing Cepheus before he could react, and dragging him outside. He called to his wife, peering over his shoulder just seconds before witnessing a soldier grab Petrichor and break her neck with a single twist, her head lying limply to one side. He tossed her body into the pond as easily as one might throw pellets to a fish. Cepheus began screaming, only to be silenced by another soldier striking him on the back of the head with his fist. For Tanager, Everything appeared in slow motion as he watched Cepheus being dragged away, unconscious, with blood running down his face. Petrichor floated face down to the surface of the pond. The rooms where the children slept were now piles of rubble and smoke, and with the roof of the house now gone, he could see the dark sky and stars above. It was a humid night, and the air was sticky. Instinctively, he sought to run after his friend, only to feel a soldier grab and slam his body to the ground, wrapping his arms behind his back and tying them together. His face was pressed into what was left of the stone floor. Moments later, he was being dragged semi-conscious across the ground, rolling over grass, dirt and rubble, cutting his body and the side of his face. He felt pain and was no longer able to open one eye. Tanager was about to lose consciousness before he was suddenly flipped over and a bright light blinded him. Fredo loomed over him, dressed in a soldier's uniform that appeared 2 sizes too small. "Sovereign Sabrina and Sovereign Hamish do not appreciate the peacekeepers' interference with their son decades ago, any more than they appreciate them ruining trade negotiations now." He kicked Tanager in the ribs. Tanager let out a groan, but could not react beyond that. "Take a message back to the peacekeepers in charge of Tara. Tell them that if they do not pull their data collectors from Earth immediately, the Royals will react swiftly, and families of Erde will meet the same fate as this one experienced here tonight." The lights faded, and Tanager lost consciousness. 15. The Vessel. Sunday morning, 5 years after the assembly. Not long after Fatima left to visit her relatives, there was a knock at the window. Tanager stood peering in from outside. Curious, Lucene opened it and slid the glass panel open. "Can I show you something?" Tanager asked, tipping his hat to her. Lucene didn't know whether the hat was a disguise, or if he had an old-fashioned notion that men should always wear a hat when outdoors and remove it when inside.
"That depends. Is it obscene?"
she answered flatly. "No. Why would it be?" said Tanager, missing the joke.
"No reason. What did you want me to see?"
"Please follow me." He held out his hand to help Lucene through the window.
"I'm good. I'm a pro at this."
She waved away his hand. Tanager stepped aside, giving her space to climb down. He continued to be confused by her choice of words. Lucene closed the window, locking it behind her and tucking the little key in her pocket.
"Okay, I'm ready."
Tanager led the way silently, heading toward Ivan's house. But instead of going to the front of the house, as Lucene had expected, he took her the back way, where Fatima's cottage and Ivan's shed shared a connected lawn, shrouded by oak and red cedar trees. She'd never seen the inside of Ivan's workshop, but having heard strange sounds emanating from it at all hours of the night, Lucene was curious. Tanager gave a knock at the door. After hearing a few odd whirs and clicks, the door slid open. Cepheus's eyes lit up in both surprise and joy at Lucene's arrival. "Lucene," he smiled, "it's nice to see you." Lucene beamed back, noticing a gentle warmth in the centre of her chest. "He's a genius," Cepheus continued, nodding toward Ivan, as if he'd waited all morning to share this information with her. Cepheus motioned toward the workbench, with what looked like a small compressor connected to an even smaller computer. Behind them, the computer projected what appeared to be the engine room of a large craft. Had it been real, it would have engulfed the entire shed. The workshop itself was filled from wall to wall and ceiling to floor with tools and gadgets. The larger items mounted neatly to the wall, the smaller bits of hardware stored in stackable containers on shelves. Ivan was too engrossed in problem-solving to do more than grunt at Lucene before returning to work. "Cepheus, you've got thinner fingers than me," See if you can thread this wire. Of course. Cepheus's eyes grew wide, half in acknowledgement of suddenly realizing Ivan's solution, and half to indicate his support. Everyone watched curiously as Cepheus delicately threaded the wire, reconnecting it to an adapter. Ivan is helping us get home faster, Tanager whispered over Lucene's shoulder. She shuddered ever so slightly at his close proximity, but did not back away. Perhaps you will decide to come with us, he said, in a manner that was half joking and half serious. Ivan briefly glanced up from his project, but said nothing.
And why would I do that?
Cepheus nodded at Tanager and resumed working with Ivan. It was almost time to begin welding. Why don't you and I take a short walk? Tanager suggested. Probably safer, Ivan agreed, handing Cepheus a spare welding mask. Lucene nodded. She'd witnessed the after-effects of Ivan's experiments gone wrong numerous times, and was happy to keep her distance.
There's a short trail behind the house, that do?
There was a pause as Tanager translated the meaning of that do. That will be perfect. They walked in silence for several minutes, before Tanager offered carefully, I'm trying to share this info with you as gently as possible.
Well, spit it out,
Lucene replied, somewhat impatiently, after a long pause.
I'm sure it will be fine.
There it was again, that stupid energy between them. What was that? Spit it out, Tanager paused. Oh, speak quickly and hold nothing back, I see.
First time to Earth?
Lucene chided. First time to any planet, actually.
Well, you've got me beat.
He eyed her curiously. The way you speak is fascinating. She felt her cheeks getting warm and quickly diverted her eyes. He fought back a small grin. I think I understand contractions now, but my slang is obviously outdated. You would be excellent if you ever decided to teach a class on Earth communications back home.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Damn it, there I go again.
Before now, she hadn't realized that nearly everything that came out of her mouth was an idiom. Tanager interrupted her thoughts. I don't think it is wise for me to spit it out. It may be too much all at once.
Well, what can you tell me? Maybe you could start by telling me what you know about my parents.
Tanager paused. Do you not remember them at all?
Did your parents never tell you that it's rude to answer a question with a question?
Tanager let out a sigh. She was proving more challenging than he expected. It was Cepheus who met your parents first, a very long time ago, on Erde. There was a long pause while Lucene struggled to connect the dots.
Are you suggesting that they were not born on Earth? Or that they were on Erde for some reason?
Your parents were born on Erde. Cepheus met them at the Terrestrial Academy of Research and Awareness, where your parents were training to become data collectors. He paused for the information to sink in. Are you familiar with what that means? She and Fatima had just discussed this.
I remember. What was their assignment?
She vaguely remembered that her dad loved plants and thought it might have something to do with horticulture. Well, it changed after you were born.
Oh.
Lucene frowned, thinking she'd interrupted their work. No, he touched her shoulder. You were, or are, a good interruption, he smiled. Your parents, he reminisced, were the kindest people, and they adored you.
Wait.
Lucene commanded. Tanager stopped in his tracks.
No, not literally.
Literally didn't help much, but he was beginning to understand the communication patterns in her mind the more time he spent with her.
How could you have known them? You've got to be at least 5 years younger than me, maybe more. Were you a baby?
Actually, I knew them very well. As it so happens, I'm actually older than you.
Really? How old are you?
I'm 56 in your timeline.
But you look half that. How is that possible?
It's just that our environment is more ideal than Earth's. Our physical systems are more evolved than yours. Therefore, we heal faster and do not age prematurely.
Prematurely? So we should be living longer?
Under the right conditions, both in the internal, physiological environment and the external environment, your average lifespan would be double what it currently is. Were it not for your medical breakthroughs, some of which we contributed to, your species would definitely not have fared as well.
I see. I understand.
Lucene clarified. Thank you, he laughed. I've started a list of common expressions and am cataloguing them. It's a long list.
I'll bet,
Lucene answered.
Oh, there's another.
Lucene wanted to know more about her parents and was about to ask, I would love to tell you lots of stories about your parents, perhaps on the long journey back home.
You are a tease. There's another. I'm afraid I can't stop myself. The hell's wrong with you, Lucene?
She thought to herself. He was making her nervous. In a he's much more attractive and interesting than I first thought kind of way. It's okay. That's how I learn. I'll bet. He smiled at picking up the term. Cepheus knew at least 99% of all Earth expressions, regardless of culture. Unfortunately, he lost much of it after the incident. Her attention was suddenly brought back to the present in an abrupt and sorrowful way. For this, she didn't need to ask. While Lucene couldn't make out the details, she could feel that Cepheus had suffered extreme physical and emotional pain, and betrayal. She could also feel how sorrowful that made Tanager, and now her as well. They will hurt you too, Tanager read her thoughts.
Hey, stay out of my head,
Lucene whined.
Is that it? Could you actually read what I'm thinking if you wanted to?
She pointed to the side of her head. I'm sorry, he apologized. We are on a similar wavelength. I pick up mostly emotions, but occasionally words and phrases too. But don't worry, your brain puts out natural blockers for anything private. It would be very difficult for me to see anything you didn't want me to.
But not impossible.
No, not impossible. Though if I sense resistance, I will try to be polite.
Well, that's reassuring,
she answered, for once without sarcasm. Did he know he was making her nervous?
Stop it, Brain, stop it. So who's trying to hurt me and why?
Tanager paused for a moment before answering. In addition to rigorous training at the Terrestrial Academy of Research and Awareness, TARA for short, data collectors voluntarily participate in a DNA splicing program. When given certain biological attributes, they were 90% more likely to respond to intuitive training. Each data collector on Earth was paired with one of the trainers on Erde. Instead of transmitting information over the airwaves, they could do so telepathically.
Neat trick,
Lucene admired. No trick, Tanager replied. It had to be the right combination of biology, training, and emotional predisposition toward compassion.
In other words, soulless jerks need not apply.
Tanager looked at her quizzically.
Never mind. So my parents had the right combination. But I've never been sliced and diced, nor given any special genes. I've never trained at your academy, and I'm not known for being the most touchy-feely of people.
No, he agreed solemnly. You are probably the last person anyone would mistake as having special skills.
Gee, thanks.
That is a good thing. It is probably what kept you safe for so long.
Not helping.
My concern is, he took her by the shoulders and looked into her eyes. She shivered slightly, but didn't resist. Your parents discovered early on that you had all the signs of someone who had received the DNA splicing, except that you hadn't. But you were born to two people who had. You are the only natural-born data collector. And from that, we can hypothesize that there exists within you the potential for great power. With training, of course. Some dangerous people can't seem to decide if they should fear you or use you. By this time, they had looped the natural trail and were back at the shed in time for Ivan to say happily, "I think we're on to something." Cepheus curled his long-nailed fingers lovingly around the compressor they had been working with. "Ivan has figured out a way to get us home in half the time it has taken us to get here." "How?" Tanager asked skeptically. "Well," Ivan scratched his head, "are you familiar with virtual machines?" "Yes." "And machine learning?" "Yes." Tanager grew increasingly more excited. "So, let's pretend the vessel has one engine with hardware abstractions that convince it that it really has two engines. It will do the trial and error all on its own until it actually figures out the engine inefficiencies to make it react as if there are actually two engines at work instead of just one." Tanager's eyes lit up. Cepheus began to bounce up and down like an excited cat. Lucene interrupted.
"Can you explain this to those of us who haven't a clue what you're talking about?"
She could feel their excitement, but understood little else. "Aye," Ivan said. "We won't know for sure until we actually install the contraption in the physical vessel. But if it works, it means they'll have enough power to get back to Erde in 6 months instead of a year."
6 months?
Lucene muttered. She couldn't even imagine 6 hours on a plane without getting claustrophobic. She couldn't imagine committing to a journey that took that long. Besides, she wasn't entirely convinced that Tanager and Cepheus could be trusted yet. It took more than 2 days to get to know someone. It had taken her a good 4.5 years before she learned to trust Ivan. And then there was a faded memory that wanted to come out, like an itch that she just couldn't seem to scratch. "You don't have to decide tonight," Tanager reassured her, feeling her apprehension. "But very soon," Cepheus added. Lucene started to turn away, the doors to the shed about to close behind her before she doubled back. The sensor on the doors triggered, and they slid back open. Tanager was the only one who looked up while the other men refocused their attention on their experiment.
"I'm helping out at the local sanctuary. There's a full moon celebration tonight. Don't suppose you'd care to join me?"
"I would be delighted," Tanager replied, nodding her head toward the two hard at work behind him. "I am useless to these gents anyway. It is best if I'm out of the way."
"Okay,"
Lucene answered.
"So I can come pick you up in Kermit."
"Kermit?"
"My car."
she explained. "Your car has a name?"
"Why wouldn't it have a name?"
"Didn't you say it was rude to answer a question with a question?" he teased. Lucene rolled her eyes.
"As I was saying, I can pick you up. Where are you staying?"
"Just over there," he pointed to the house.
"You're staying with Ivan?"
How had she not noticed that?
"Both of you?" "Never mind. In that case, can you meet me by the window, say 6 p.m.?
"Certainly," he smiled. "By the window at 6. Lucene began to walk away. "Wait, please." Lucene turned around. "You feel far more emotionally stable than one would expect considering the information I just gave you. Why?"
"Maybe once you've spent more time in my head, you'll understand. It all makes perfect sense to me. I've never felt like I've belonged on Earth. Never."